In the first couple of decades of its existence, the Kaiserliche Marine was trying to sort out what ships it had, from absorbing the Prussian Navy and those of other coastal German states. A few coast defence ships had been built, but by the mid-1880s even ships designed a decade earlier, based largely around the central battery concept, were somewhat obsolete compared with newer vessels. At the same time, the new German state was mostly concerned with its land borders, so the budget was minimal outside of ensuring that in a future conflict the ports could at least be kept safe from close blockade. Thus, whilst concept designs looked at possibilities ranging from tiny craft that were basically guns mounted on overly large pontoons, all the way through to full-on capital ships with an unusually large number of main battery guns, realistically, the only thing everyone who voted for the funding was likely to agree on was a number of powerful coast defence ships, especially since the Kiel Canal, currently being completed, would add to the number of areas that would need defending in time of conflict. In order to ensure the greatest number could be acquired, they started small, with a design of 3,500 tons displacement. The main battery would consist of 3 single 240mm or 9.4-inch guns, a calibre that would hang around subsequent German battleship designs for quite some time. One of these would be placed aft, but, as with most navies of the period, ramming was still seen as a significant tool, and so the other two were placed side by side forward, a feature that would show up on a few other capital ships of the period. Each of these was mounted in a turret that reflected more features of later fully armoured barbettes that we today call turrets, as compared to the old cylindrical turrets of the Ericsson and Coles lineages that were still in vogue in many navies. It was initially thought that half a dozen 37mm guns would be fine against torpedo boats, but tests quickly disabused them of that notion, and instead the ships would be built with 8 short-barrelled 88mm guns and half a dozen machine guns. 4 lightweight torpedo tubes rounded things out, all above water, with one pointing in each direction. As the build times of the ships would end up spanning the late 1880s and early 1890s, with the first ship laid down in 1888 and the last in 1891, the first 3 would end up carrying compound armour, and the last 3 an early Krupp steel formulation. The belt was as thick as the calibre of the main guns at 240mm or 9.4 inches, whilst propulsion came courtesy of a pair of vertical triple expansion engines driving 2 screws using just under 5,000 indicated horsepower to hit between 14 and 15 knots, depending on the ship in question. 6 vessels were built: Siegfried, Beowulf, Frithjof, Heimdall, Hildebrand and Hagen, entering service between 1890 and 1894. However, the roughly 10 years between their conception and the last one entering service had still been following a rather breakneck speed of advancement, and less than a year later the first true pre-dreadnoughts were entering service. Thus, less than a decade into their own service, they were all given major refits, in effect rebuilds. This lengthened the ships, added a pair of extra 88mm guns, moved all the torpedo tubes, except the stern one, under the water, and upgraded all but the bow tube from a 14-inch to 18-inch torpedoes, as well as doubling the available fuel, resulting in displacement going up to just north of 4,000 tons. As these refits were being completed in the early 1900s, Germany was getting stuck into the early stages of the Anglo-German naval arms race, and so the ships were retained, even though their intended replacements, namely some of the Helgoland and Kaiser-class dreadnoughts, were brought into service as the 1900s turned into the 1910s. This retention was justified on the grounds that the new ships were supposed to go out looking for trouble, whereas the Siegfrieds would still be needed to guard the Kiel Canal and ports. However, by mid-1915 it was pretty clear that anything that managed to fight its way through to the German coast through the entire high seas fleet was not going to be overly troubled by a pint-sized late-model ironclad or two, and so they were decommissioned, so their crews could be put to better use. Most were assigned for use as barrack ships after some limited offensive roles in the Baltic. Beowulf was used as a training target for U-boats, and the class was sold off completely just before the Treaty of Versailles. Hagen, Heimdall, and Siegfried went to the breakers pretty quickly. Hildebrand would have shared that fate, but decided to take a detour into the Dutch coast and wrecked herself there instead. Beowulf spent a couple of years in the Baltic as an icebreaker, putting her ram bow to good use, before being scrapped in the early 1920s, whilst Frithjof ended up being converted into one of the world's more unusual merchantmen, wandering the seas with some of her old torpedo tubes still visible until the end of the 1920s, when she too went to the breakers.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.